with this panel, which is focused on corporate governance, corporate actions. And as Susan Ruffo noted this morning, she's the Associate Director for Climate Preparedness at the White House, up to 85% of critical infrastructure in the US is in fact owned by the private sector. So here we'll be looking at how are businesses looking at resilience? What are they doing now, and is it enough? What are their incentives? Are those incentives properly aligned? And are there things that industry can be doing better and that government can be doing or should be doing to either help align those incentives or create regulations or take other actions that might help business do a better job of addressing resilience? So we've got a fantastic panel here of a very diverse group of people, world experts from a number of different areas. We've got, in short, the insurance industry, the finance industry, industry itself, heavy industry, and law. And I thought we'd start in that order. And so Lindene Patton is with the insurance industry. She's with Zurich Financial Services. She's the Chief Climate Product Officer at Zurich. And Zurich is the largest insurance company in Switzerland. It's also one of the 100 largest public companies, at least according to some statistics. And Lindene is responsible for risk management related to climate change. So I thought Lindene would be the perfect person, coming from a Swiss insurer, to sort of set the broad picture. What are the risks facing business? How does your industry assess those risks? And basically, how big a risk to industry is climate and climate resilience, and is the industry doing enough?
I might not get to the last point. This is in 3 minutes. That's tough. Let me set a couple of framing context comments. Particularly, climate change impacts impact business models, particularly the risk management components of models. Why? The impacts tend to affect not only natural resources, but physical assets. And the assumptions in most business models that determine how you achieve profitability are looking at how long will a particular asset last, how much natural resource is there that we can have that's not costed. It may be an externality, might be free, or might not cost as much as a substitute, for example. The assumptions in many cases are that materials that are supplied by others will come, and that if they don't, that insurance will come into play and pay for the failure to deliver. So there are lots of underlying assumptions in the way that existing business models are set, whether those are local businesses only or whether they are global businesses, which are fundamentally changed as the impacts of climate change present themselves. Whether that happens to be a flood in Thailand, or whether which causes disruptions to supply chains that are not accounted for, whether that happens to be a significant storm involving a lot of storm surge and interruption on the eastern seaboard, or whether that happens to be a lot of fire in the center of the US. Name your hazard, name your risk, name your location, and what you find is that the expectations that business had when it was establishing estimations about what could go wrong, how that would impact their model, what it would cost, all of those underlying assumptions need to be reconsidered. So when you're faced with that issue, the question is, what are those assumptions that are being fundamentally impacted when you consider increased frequency and severity, or severity of significant extreme events, and particularly weather-related extreme events, short-term and long-term? Lifeline services, power, water, transportation systems tend to be significantly impacted under circumstances of extreme events. The assumption by most local businesses is that when they go to work, or when they want to get to their business and make it go, they flip the light switch on, power comes on. They can actually drive a vehicle or use transportation to get to work and to get their employees to work. All of those are underlying assumptions about a basic business model. And when you think about risk management in a business model, you need to think about what you can do when there is an extreme event to reduce those losses. And guess what? When it comes to shared services, especially lifeline utility services, as individual companies or corporations, beyond having a backup generator or perhaps backup water supply, there's really not a way to have a backup road in most cases or transportation access. You can do things to harden your supply chain, but there are challenges that come down to community-based core economic lifeline services that I think represent one part of the challenge in the context of governance for creating appropriate risk management solutions in a frame of climate change. Similarly, there are demand challenges. So I have worked on projects in the insurance industry where we have done things like try to help companies or individuals respond to potential negative impacts to property in the case of severe impacts from weather events. So for example, if there was a structure that we provided property coverage for, and there were a severe weather event of high wind or water in which that structure was damaged, we have written insurance contracts in which we promise to rebuild to a higher building code standard, a more resilient standard than exists. The cost for those insurance products are more, but only reflecting over the pool the amount of the increased cost to actually rebuild. The frequency of loss is the same. The interesting thing is that products like that and products which offer coverage, for example, for things like carbon capture and sequestration, suffer from a severe demand problem. So I think the kinds of challenges that we face in the insurance industry is dealing with the fact that, and most industry faces, is that the presence of climate change affects the fundamental socio-economic model that persists in almost all organized developed markets. And what you're talking about is sort of rejiggering that model and basically recreating the house, recreating your economic house. And while I think scientists have done an excellent job at looking at physical impacts and physical science, and the sophistications of the models are tremendous, what we have not done is necessarily spend as much time looking at the economic impact and option models for creating a transition to take us from where we are today, which is exposed in the context of climate change with respect to resilience, to where we need to be to assure that assets that we invest in that have a particular capital life can achieve resiliency of an expected character, like you can turn the lights on or you can drive to work because the road's not underwater or the electricity system works, over the useful life of the capital investments that exist. And I think the challenges that we face in the governance context in addressing these issues are quite community-based and particularly complicated by consumer price regulation. Most particularly if you look at any utility, utilities are maybe quote unquote or owned by private industry, but they may be operating in a regulated environment and particularly a price regulated environment. And because there continues to be questions about timing, which is very important for capital investment, of the impacts of climate change in the general public's view, there is always a little bit of pushback when it comes in the regulatory context for approving costs for pass-through of improvement of resilience. And so I would say that the greatest challenge that we face as scientists is trying to join up in an interdisciplinary way so we can look at more sophisticated analysis of not only taking the value that we've got out of the physical assessments that exist, but translating that into a way that we can communicate in the capital investment value so that we can move forward and give, especially consumer price regulators, a level of comfort that investments are no regrets investments, or if there is no such thing as a no regrets investments, they are a wise resilience investment because the consequences of the economic disruption that will result locally and not locally from certain extreme weather events are pretty significant, and not only impact local people, but can impact more broadly in the economy. So I'll stop my comments there by saying I think we have work to do, but the good news is it's really interesting work, and it's very needed.
Thank you, Lindene. I think that was a great setup, and in a word, I think what Lindene sort of, to try to summarize a couple of her take-home points, are that as the climate changes, as the risk changes, then the way of measuring that risk and the way in which industries have been set up changes. And if they were set up under one sort of system of risk and one approach, and now that changes, and that is something that fundamentally needs to be looked at. And also that a lot of the changes or a lot of the risks are community-based, are things that an individual industry alone cannot address, either because they're dealing with things like how they get their fundamental services like water or power. So at least those were two of my takeaways from Lindene. Next, we're moving on to the finance industry. Jackie Roberts is with the global asset management firm, the Carlyle Group. She's their Chief Sustainability Officer and leads Carlyle's global environment, social, and governance efforts. But before you come to the conclusion that she's just a financial sellout, you should know that she previously spent 17 years at Environmental Defense Fund. So has also put in her service to the NGO. So, Jackie, I'm going to turn it over to you. But I guess we'd be very interested in hearing how the finance sector, and in particular an asset management firm, looks at the risks associated with the resiliency, and how you see the industry looking at and responding to those risks.
So I don't know how many folks here are familiar with how private equity tends to operate. Is this a world? Yes? No? So in private equity, what all of my colleagues do is they go and look for opportunities to buy companies. Often it's a division that's being spun out of a larger company. DuPont will decide they don't want to be in the paints and coatings for automobiles business anymore, and they want to sell it off. It's not part of their strategy. Or it'll be a small company like Beats, which has been growing rapidly, and we bought a year ago, and then Apple came knocking on our door and wanted to buy it after only a year. Usually that doesn't happen. But we buy companies, and generally when we buy companies, we do it with the idea that we can really improve how they operate. Sometimes it's helping them go global because we really understand how to move into markets overseas. Sometimes it's helping them do a better job with their operations and supply chain. Increasingly, sustainability issues have been part of that opportunity and have expanded from being just a risk-based assessment for a company, making sure that we understand all the risks they're facing on sustainability issues. And that really covers both environmental and social issues, but to opportunities. I mean, how do we really help companies be smarter, have more sort of opportunities to innovate and then sell that to their customers and really have it work to their advantage. So I've been there a short period of time, only about 4 months, and we have businesses in all kinds of sectors that, from Africa, where we have a business that's related to agriculture, so you can imagine droughts are relevant there. We have, virtually, most of our portfolio depends on the basic lifeline services that we were just talking about in terms of energy. Most of them have bought diesel generators as backup, which as an environmentalist I hate, right, is that they go up, because particularly after Sandy, 50% of them didn't even work. So it's not a particularly good resiliency solution anyways. But all of these companies, tend to learn about risks and opportunities in a much more experiential way. So they see Nike getting lambasted for child labor issues because there's a photo of a child making a Nike soccer ball. And they take that to heart. They say, I don't want to be that company. I don't want to be in that position. Yes, I'm going to pay attention to my child labor issues, and I get it. The challenge with resiliency is Katrina hits, and it's not one company being held up as sort of mismanaging the issue, and therefore they're getting stung. Everybody is affected, and nobody is blamed, and so it sort of seems like it's an act of God they can't control. And so even though, I think as a portfolio, we have lots of ways in which we need to think about resiliency. We have a lot of real estate, ways in which we could sell that to the people who then 5 years later come and buy our companies, because we buy a company, we improve it, and then we sell it, just like, some people buy houses and improve them and sell them. We do the same with companies. We want the buyers to appreciate what we've done, but we haven't heard any buyers talking about resiliency. So, so we can't, there's no really value at exit for us, because buyers aren't saying, could you have done this? If an insurance company is asking us for, what we're doing around this because it's going to affect our insurance rates, that will get folks' attention. But sometimes, it's okay, so our insurance rates are going up, and then we're going to pass that on to whoever buys this next, or whoever, it'll be passed on to shareholders or something. So one of the challenges with the financial industry is very short time horizons. We at least have, not quarterly horizons, but actually 3 to 5 year horizons, which makes it a bit easier to look at some of these issues. But fairly short time horizons, which don't connect really with what needs to happen on resiliency. And so I think this is an area where the private sector can be an incredibly important mover, but they need governance, and that's to put the level playing field out there. So if it's going to be through utility rates rising, but you get a discount if you've implemented some resiliency measures, and by the way, we're able to implement backup energy in a way that we do it through batteries, and so we're able to shift our peak power consumption so we save money on a day-to-day basis. So there's a twofer there that we can find. Or, we want to do more resiliency around an ecosystem in a floodplain area and build up the wetlands. And in that situation, we also happen to have a lot of airline travel, so we can count the carbon credits, and so we can offset some of our airline travel. So again, we kind of get a twofer. So I think you're going to see the private sector really just doing things here where it's a co-benefit of something else they're going to do already, until they are come under a larger governance structure, either through utilities or states, and maybe state incentives. I could see, there's things that utilities have put out there for rebates and other things that, can help folks bring in more backup power that is more sustainable backup power. So a little bit of that is happening in the New Jersey area. But, I think that insurance rates as a driver is really, really important for the private sector. The utility conversation is very, very important. And then I think it will be state and federal regulations before you really see the private sector understanding this and embracing this. And then I'll end with just echoing one thing that Lindene said, which is, we really understand well, I think, the physical manifestations of resilience, but what's it going to cost a business is not quantified at all. So, after the fact, maybe somebody will go back and look at it, but I think that sense of what does this risk really mean in terms of my business is not well quantified. So again, it sort of seems out of, an act of God, out of control, not something that they can manage for, and managing for risk is what, leading businesses is all about. So, yeah, there. That's all I'll end with that.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Bottom line I got from that, from your presentation, was that the incentives, the structures are currently not well aligned to provide the financial incentives that are sort of correctly track the risk incentives with resilience. We're now going to turn to Jeff Hopkins. Jeff is the Vice President for Policy and Analysis at C2ES, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, formerly known as the Pew Climate Center. And Jeff has a lot of experience working with business at both C2ES, where he works with the Business Environment Leadership Council, which is a group of leading companies showing leadership on climate, as well as his previous position where he was the lead for climate policy engagement at Rio Tinto, which is a multinational metals and mining corporation. And Jeff, I've seen you talk on this before, so I know you have a lot to say about the resilience efforts that Rio Tinto has done in the past. But in the course of your remarks, I hope you will also get at sort of the comments or the critiques that Lindene and Jackie made, that one, that the risks are changing, but industry isn't paying attention to those risks, and two, that the financial incentives are not well aligned with trying to address those risks. Jeff?
Thank you very much. Great comments, and I'm just really pleased to be here and be talking about resiliency. I have talked about it a few times and have run into David in some of those. And I appreciate the comments of Lindene and Jackie. Maybe my experience with Rio Tinto is a little bit different. Maybe it's a special case, and I'd point out a couple reasons why it's a special case. We talked about the short time horizon, 3 to 5 years. Most mining companies, building smelters, refineries, those sorts of investments are multi-decade. When I worked with Rio Tinto, they had a mine in Salt Lake City that had been around for over 100 years. Another one in Boron, California, which had been around for 100 years. So the outlook is a little bit longer. And I think that may result in a little bit more of a longer view. You're forced to take a longer view. Another aspect, I think, that has to do with extractives in general is that they fall into that camp that own their own infrastructure. So some of these barriers that people have in terms of regulatory barriers or just the numerical problem of how do you get enough people together to decide about something, to make an investment, is you can abstract from that. The supply chains, both getting materials in and getting materials out, are very long, and while you do interact with many others, you know, a lot of it you own yourself. And a couple of examples that I'm going to give are infrastructure type examples where the decision was made to make them more resilient. And I'll tell a little bit about why they decided to do that. Given that the whole conference is about resilience, I'll skip this slide, just saying that it's important that weather and climate impacts are costly. That's why businesses pay attention to them. That's why you guys are paying attention to them. I applaud you for that. Rio Tinto used to always talk about their business strategy. And the business strategy was not something that they kept under wraps. It wasn't hidden. They talked about it all the time. What their objective was to operate assets that were long-lived, low-cost, high-quality. This is an example of flooding in Australia in 2008. That asset wouldn't have any of those characteristics. So you don't want to operate an asset that's long life is being threatened, whose costs are rising, whose quality is endangered because of climate disruptions, extreme weather. And even if you did, and I don't know if you can see this, but this is just a shovel halfway covered. This is actually a railroad bed and track that just got washed out, completely washed out by flooding, so nothing's going in or out of that mine. And then you have employees and the impacts on them. So no company, no matter how big you are, you're not going to internalize all these issues. Definitely something, to the extent that you can, you would bring it inside a comfortable risk management framework of you have a number, you don't know what the future is. You have no idea what this future outcome is going to be, but you can look at it from a risk perspective and reach an equilibrium between what the costs of avoiding the risk versus what the risks are. And I think that is one way in which business is willing to talk about this. Another aspect of this, just in talking about climate, is, some of this is language, but climate change, at least for managers and operators, it's in the viewpoint that it's something that's happening far in the future. Adaptation as well. Adaptation is happening to a changed climate sometime in the future. Resilience is a risk of an adverse event today that impacts you today. And even if it's a low probability, it's got to be in your model. It's got to be in your business model. You need to have some way to address it. So resilience, the discussion of resilience is one that businesses, I think, are having all the time, and they're finding it much easier to have that conversation internally than the climate change conversation and the adaptation conversation. It's just language. C2ES did a report that they released last year called Weathering the Storm, which meant to look at how companies perceive the risk, what are they doing to manage risk and realize opportunities, and what are the gaps. What C2ES did in this study was examine what companies were saying, Carbon Disclosure Project, filings with the SEC, sustainability reports, annual reports, interviews with specific companies. Rio Tinto was interviewed, so I was involved in this. Even before I joined C2ES, I was involved in talking about resiliency efforts and was part of this study and a workshop. Their, surveyed audience was a group called the S&P Global 100. And just a quick summary of the results. The companies are disclosing information on risk. 9 out of 10 companies recognize weather and climate risks in some aspect, talk about it in some aspect, and they tend to view it as a risk management problem, not a binary sort of thing, but nobody, if they're businesses, they don't know what their sales are going to be, they don't know what their costs are going to be, yet still they persevere and put a business model in place in the face of that uncertainty. In all those risks, resilience is really no different in that aspect. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you know that you need to pay attention to it. Quality of disclosure was highly variable. People tended to look at the symptoms, and even when they proposed that what they were doing was addressing climate change, they weren't really changing baseline climate. They were maybe just kind of bumping up their level of planning in the face of that. Not all the companies that were surveyed were extractive, so they probably are more like the companies where the infrastructure is a problem. You rely on public infrastructure, and you may have a shorter time horizons, and the regulatory barriers as well. A lot of companies talk about climate change when they were talk about resilience when they were talking about climate change. It's really the same point. It's not, at least this survey showed that they weren't really filtering that down into their financial disclosures. Discussions of materiality were really brief, if at all. So it's kind of a start, I think, is all you could say. A couple examples of Rio Tinto actions. There's a diamond mine about 600 kilometers north of Yellowknife. It's only connected to Yellowknife by an ice road, which means that you can only get stuff in and out of Yellowknife when the ice road is present. And that can be a problem, especially if you have an early thaw or if you have a light winter. What are you going to do if you can't get there and back this ice road? How do people have power? They're way off the grid. In fact, everybody who lives up in this area, nobody's on the grid. Everybody uses diesel generators. It's the only option. So what Rio Tinto did was they did the same thing. They used the ice road to get diesel back and forth. They located a wind farm. It's a wind farm that's operating at minus 40 degrees centigrade, and they've had great experience with it there. That's the sort of resiliency story which I think is something that they stumbled upon. Happens to be an abatement story as well, but it's a good resiliency initiative. Another one, and this is infrastructure just as well, where Rio Tinto really makes its money is selling iron ore to China. So Northwest Australia is very subject to extreme weather events, to cyclones. There was one January 2013, which was just headed right for the offloading facilities used in the Pilbara, the iron ore producing region of Australia. And thankfully, it didn't impact production, but it definitely could have. And what Rio Tinto did now about 3 or 4 years ago was do a study of how they could make that port facility resilient to storms. And they ended up, when they were rebuilding it or expanding it, raising it a half meter as a result of storm surge likelihood. So a couple of examples there tend to be related to infrastructure. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. It sounds like in a number of ways, Jeff, your experience and at Rio Tinto may be more the exception than the rule in terms of looking further out and having longer time horizons, which may be why C2ES in their wisdom and foresight decided that you would be a good person to hire. Let's see. So we are now going to turn to Michael Gerrard. Michael is the director of the Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. He's one of the leading experts in climate law. He's the author of 11 books. One of those, The Law of Adaptation to Climate Change, U.S. and International Aspects. Just to pick one example, give you a sense for how closely Michael is tied and how much of an expert in this area he is. Michael, in a couple of the talks we've heard reference to utilities, to rate structures, to lowest cost, to trying to recover those rates. I know you've been involved in a few of those areas. So we've heard about, so far, a number of deficiencies in sort of the current incentives for business. And I'm hoping what you'll do is give us some perspective on what you have been doing and what the role for law and government in trying to address some of those imbalances. Michael?
Thank you, David. I'm going to start by talking about one particular case that lies at the intersection of corporate action, governance, resilience, and the role of scientists, and then I'm going to talk about some broader implications of that. Hurricane Sandy in October of 2012 led to widespread and extended power blackouts in the New York metropolitan region. Shortly after that, we, the Center for Climate Change Law, filed a petition with the New York Public Service Commission asking them to require all of the public utilities they regulate, electricity, gas, cable, telephone, private water, to come up with climate resilience plans. Shortly after that, Con Ed filed for its next rate increase, and it included $1 billion in storm hardening. It turned out that that was mostly building seawalls around substations and elevating equipment so that they could prepare for the next Hurricane Sandy-like event. But in looking at it more closely, we concluded that there are a lot of other climate-related events that could also affect Con Ed in a way that wouldn't be touched by this, most particularly extreme heat. Extreme heat turns out to be the kind of event that in a urban area is most likely to lead to high mortality as a result of climate change, and there have been some instances in Europe and Russia and other places where that has actually happened. So we used the legal process to intervene formally in the rate proceeding by Con Ed. So did NRDC and EDF and Pace Law School. And we pressed the point that Con Ed should look more broadly than at storms of a Sandy type variety and should look at a broader array of climate events. We brought in a number of climate scientists from Columbia's Earth Institute who gave presentations to the top engineers of Con Ed, who really were surprisingly receptive. They're engineers, they speak math, they understood the presentations, and that launched a collaborative process that went over a period of months to try to figure out what Con Ed ought to do. The conclusion is that Con Ed ought to take a look at the future climate projections for its service area, develop additional data that had not been developed, such as humidity levels. It turns out humidity levels have an important impact both on the demand for electricity and the ability to supply electricity. Otherwise, push the science forward with projections and then come up with a plan to cope with the sorts of climate changes that were projected by this study. We were able to announce a settlement agreement in the end of December last year. It needed to be approved by the State Public Service Commission because this was going to be at the expense of the ratepayers, which may also have been a factor that made Con Ed more receptive than it might otherwise have been. And in February of this year, the Public Service Commission issued an order not only approving this particular settlement, but saying that it was such a good idea that they want all of the regulated utilities in New York to undertake similar measures. So this has a lot of broader applicability. All 50 states have public utility regulatory structures. In every state, one of the core mandates of that structure is to assure the reliability of the system as it's supplying essential services like electricity and water and gas. Most of them have procedural structures that allow citizen intervention and also business intervention to try to help participate in that. And so we are working on expanding this and taking the experience in New York and bringing it nationwide so that regulated utilities around the country will go through this systematic process. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has responsibilities at the national level for the interstate transmission system and the bulk power system, and they will also be taking a look at this. There are a number of other legal tools that are available. One very important one is the National Environmental Policy Act and its state equivalents, which require, as you know, environmental impact assessment of significant actions that require a discretionary governmental action. The Council on Environmental Quality in the White House, the unit that is in charge of overall implementing, issuing the regulations under NEPA, issued draft guidelines in February of 2010 that called not only for disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions, but also the adaptation side, the effect that climate change could have on projects. CEQ has not yet finalized the regulations, and what we now see is a hodgepodge of actions by federal agencies. Some of the federal agencies are being very proactive in the environmental impact assessment process and taking a look at the effect that future climate conditions will have on the projects that they are building, with the underlying principle being that an assessment should look not only at the climate conditions that will exist when the project opens, but also at the end of its useful life. You don't want to build a highway or an airport or a railroad that will not be able to withstand the weather conditions that are anticipated during its useful life. Other agencies are doing almost nothing. This is in the absence of clear federal administrative guidance, and so there are some litigation options that may be employed to try to get more effective and more consistent action by the federal agencies. The SEC disclosure has been mentioned, and again in 2010, the SEC issued guidance on securities disclosure for climate-related issues, talking not only about the risk of regulation, but the risk of climate change itself. There, too, there has been very spotty implementation and enforcement, and there, too, I think that there is room for citizens and others who would like more disclosure to take action. In a number of environmental permitting processes, this is also relevant. Under the Clean Water Act, permits are required for water pollution discharges under the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System and its state equivalents. Those often assume certain levels of stream flows for where the pollution is going to be going. Those increasingly need to look at the effect that climate change is going to have on stream flows and also on water temperatures, which are relevant especially to discharges of heated water from power plants. Climate change is changing the location and size and physical character of wetlands, which are heavily regulated by the Corps of Engineers and EPA, and so there are legal requirements that could be employed to take a look at future climate change in that context. In the context of hazardous waste cleanup and remediation, one issue that is increasingly being examined is if the water level is rising and you have a cap on a landfill or a contaminated site, you don't want to be in a situation where the water has risen up to the cap. That is not ideal for containing the substances. And so there is increasing attention being devoted to thinking about future climate in that context. And finally, in the whole realm of approval of new infrastructure, whether it's highways, railroads, bridges, dams, airports, and so forth, there are emerging legal requirements to look at climate change. Again, it is very spotty. We are not getting the sort of consistent, systematic guidance from the top that we should, but I think we're making progress. And in furtherance of trying to make progress, there are environmental organizations and academic organizations that are trying to press for more systematic analysis of this and bringing in climate scientists. I think there are lots of opportunities. Since we're sitting here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I thought it was appropriate to talk about this. There are a lot of opportunities to bring scientists into these regulatory processes and to bring their expertise to bear. Often there is a disconnect between what the scientists have discovered and what the regulators know about, and many of the companies know about and deal with. And so there are many regulatory opportunities to forge that linkage, and we look forward to a continuation and strengthening of those linkages. Thank you.
Well, after hearing Michael go through the list of actions that the Center for Climate Change Law has taken, and the list of successes and things they're working on, maybe the conclusion might be that all you need to do to address corporate resilience is have somebody like Michael and his center sitting in every state or every city. Michael, it really is a fairly impressive list. And I think just in terms of overall structure here, we have about half an hour left, so I'm going to start off with a few questions of my own to the panelists, and then we'll have time for the audience. And I think I'll start with one to Michael. So Michael, you have talked about a lot of opportunities on the regulatory side, using law, using community intervention, using shareholder or other ways for folks to get involved in the regulatory process, and then also some executive action. You referenced CEQs, I guess draft recommendations on incorporating resiliency into environmental impact statements. Do you think that, those set of actions, do you think there are enough tools available through the existing regulatory landscape or possibly, with other executive actions through the regulatory landscape, as well as lawsuits and citizen action, to address climate resilience for corporations? Or do we really need to have a sort of a fundamental new government, federal law looking at resilience?
So, of course, one of the difficulties is that the pace of climate change and the magnitude of what is likely to happen in the coming decades may well overwhelm the existing both physical as well as legal systems we have. In the ideal world, we would have a comprehensive statute that would address not only adaptation but mitigation. Given the current dysfunctionality of Congress, we're stuck with statutes that were written a generation ago. And so we saw the other day that EPA issued a proposed regulation of 650 pages, massively complex, but probably the best they could do under the existing statute. It would be lovely to have a comprehensive adaptation approach. It's much more difficult than it is with mitigation, of course, because with mitigation, there's basically one thing you want to control. You want to control the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted. With adaptation, it's a much broader variety. But since we despair of getting any constructive action by Congress in the foreseeable future, there are a lot of existing tools that can be utilized.
Thank you. And if you have questions, go ahead and stand up and start moving towards the microphones. In the meantime, another couple from me. So, Michael, you mentioned Congress and the dysfunction of Congress, and you know, it's probably safe to say, sort of from my overall impressions from the audience, as well as from working in Washington, that a lot of people within the federal agencies who come to Washington believe that the government can come up with solutions that will help industry, help communities, et cetera, address problems such as resilience. However, if you go to Capitol Hill, you probably have, you know, maybe about half of the population there that also believes more or less the same thing, and then you have another half of the population that fundamentally believes government is already doing too much, and that really the role for solutions need to come from, you know, people themselves or communities themselves acting on their own. Are there businesses, and I'll open this question to any of you, are there businesses that really are the government shouldn't really be involved in trying to define what their resilience risks are? Are there businesses where either their resilience issues are relatively small because, you know, if you're worried about a 1 in 100 year storm for a business which has, you know, a 3 or 4 or 5 year model, and of course there are lots of businesses that only operate for a couple of years. And, you know, arguably you might say, well, the business community as a whole is very resilient, because despite the changes that we have seen in the economy and technology, in population, in everything else, in cities over the last 100 years, the business community constantly redefines itself and comes up with new businesses. And yes, businesses go out of business all the time, but you know, for every time one goes out of business, there are more coming into business. So are there segments that are resilient where it really doesn't need to be the government focus? Any of you?
Well, let me just say one thing. The fact that you have a 1 in 100 year storm doesn't mean that a 3-year business has 97 years before there's the storm. And so if the risk is high enough, it could wipe out that business, even if it's a 3-year business. And I think one central role for government in all of these, for everything, is to make the risk clear and transparent, and so that any investor and anyone making these decisions will be aware of what the risks are. And the National Climate Assessment, which came out, most recent version, a couple of months ago, I think goes a long way toward providing that geographically specific kind of information that private businesses can then use to plan their own risk.
Jeff, you do a lot of look. You have looked a lot at climate, at how businesses look at climate and weather risk. How does that stack up to other risks for you know, say the average business in terms of their, you know, whatever other categories of risk they have, you know, shareholder risk or financial risk or whatever? How does climate and weather tend to stack up?
Well, I mean, in some ways it's similar, in the sense that people are trying to forecast and address cyclical risk. So weather patterns are certainly cyclical, just like the business cycle is cyclical. But there are other ways where, you know, you have climate, which is this, you know, kind of slow-moving thing that is not cyclical. It's systemic. So I'd say there are some examples of differences. The hard part with this is that everybody is really kind of motivated to capitalize their gains and socialize their losses. So even if there are some businesses that are, are not, susceptible to this as others, it's hard to tell that after the fact, and they're motivated to assert otherwise.
Jackie, I think you were about to say something.
Well, no, I mean, when you really get down to it, I mean, there's not a single business in our portfolio that could not in some way be affected, right? I mean, even software companies rely on data centers, and data centers could either be, they're very vulnerable to the basic, utility setup. And so I think that there is I mean, so there really isn't. I mean, that knowledge institutions really tend to be more nonprofit, like a university or something, but they've got huge physical infrastructure. So, I was trying to think about the companies that we own that really don't have as many physical assets do tend to rely now on the internet and software so heavily that they're going to get, they're susceptible that way. So I don't think there is, any business out there that isn't in some way at risk. And the question is, they don't see it really on, day to day. I mean, they don't see it in any different than, they think about, well, periodically there's a brownout somewhere, and let's just hope it doesn't happen in my state.
Yeah, and I would just quickly say that what the comments are going to is that we live in a really interconnected world, and we've done a lot of work with the World Economic Forum. Annually they produce something called the Global Risk Report, in that it begins to look at some of those relationships. But in the context of government, the key is, do you have a resilient community? Do you have a resilient economy, and what are those building blocks? And that's really why I think many of us have been focusing on the function of shared infrastructure as a core functionality that enables then business to continue and have some consistency there. But I think that's where you see whether, it's not that businesses aren't looking at these issues, they're looking at the issues that they can impact. And then there needs to probably be a new framework to have a dialogue about those things that are in an infrastructure context. And I think many of those dialogues are going on. I would not want to suggest that this is a novel or new idea that, exists. This is a dialogue that is ongoing, and there are some really good work that's being done in the context of measurement. DOE's got some efforts that are going. DOE has some very interesting work which is going on, which is developing metrics for measuring resiliency in the context of utilities. There are other experimentations which are going on in the same context. So it's not that no one's looking at anything. It's just that it hasn't quite gotten to the point where we've gotten out of the analysis. Well, some of my friends used to tease us when we were in the chemical business about analysis paralysis. So gotta get out of the study mode and get to the pilot and implementation mode,
Let's turn to some questions from the audience. Let's take two, first here and then here.
Hi, my name is Christina Hudson. I work for Leidos, and I think my question and what I was thinking about will align well with the recent discussion. So there are discussions, and we are sort of on a path moving forward, and there is, as Jackie just stated, not one company, not one city that doesn't have risk of some sort and doesn't rely on the commons to remain viable. I'm not going to use the word resilience. I think it's overused. This is a strategic risk management issue. So have you seen, or do you expect to see, any examples of true valuation, let's not even say true, any valuation of some sort in the sale of a company from one owner to another, or the transfer of property of one owner to another, that actually expresses, as well as can be, the opportunities or the risks that they have shared, and that they're being counted and accounted for without litigation, without regulation, but someone is sharing, opening up the door and saying, here's my company, here's my supply chain, here's where I could fall down, and here's where the wonderful opportunities are because I've bought the company by the Carlyle Group and I've made it more resilient. I use that word, darn it. And therefore, as a shareholder or as a potential owner, this is to your benefit.
And question over here as well.
Hi, my name is Leah Catania. I work at C2ES with Jeff. And both Lindene and Jackie, you spoke about the climate change challenges facing your respective industries and how governance is needed to address these. And so what specific types of policies or incentives do you see as necessary to increase the resilience of your sectors?
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to ask everyone on the panel to take your microphone and move it closer to your face, because apparently people are having trouble hearing us. Okay, so there were two questions. One was, have you ever seen an example of true valuation in a company during its sale from one company to another without regulation or litigation? That sounds like a question probably to Jackie, maybe to Lindene as well. And then the second question was about the types of policies necessary And I'll let anyone jump in on that one.
So the first one is, I think valuing these different initiatives as you sell or as you move to an IPO or something along those lines is really, really important, and has started happening with other related issues, but not adaptation. And I'll give you an example. We own a company that has interoperability equipment, and so it helps Verizon talk to somebody else. You would not. It's called Cineverse, so you would not have known this brand name. But because Verizon and Vodafone and some of their major customers really were putting a spotlight on their supply chain and the carbon footprint, not the resilience of it, but the carbon footprint of their supply chain, it prompted our company to really do a lot more around setting carbon reduction goals, about seeing what they could do. They've had a lot of success, made huge progress. And all of that is something I'm helping them put together and market as we think about eventually, because we eventually sell all of our companies. But what then was interesting is there were some additional co-benefits that we were able to identify, particularly around talent recruitment, which is very important in that sector. So, that whole telecom sector, it's all about, who you recruit and hold. And a lot of young people, particularly in India and other places, were asking about what the company was doing on sustainability during the job interviews. We were able to show added benefits in employee engagement and sort of retention. And so I could see, as you begin to build that story, if somehow some of those climate reduction measures involved bringing in renewables so you could get off the grid in an emergency situation, you could begin to also talk about having a more resilient infrastructure that you've built that gives you backup to the common infrastructure. So I do think, we could see that happening, but I can't think of an example yet where we've been able to do that, and that has happened so far.
So happening to some extent, but not perfectly.
Well, happening certainly around carbon and climate issues, but then adding in resiliency as opposed to mitigation, I have not seen happen with our companies, but I think, Jeff, you might have had a different experience.
Well, it's awful hard to tell what is really impacting valuations of companies at any point in time. One sector that I think is starting to reflect this, and it's just something that I've got my eyes on, is energy storage. Because energy storage has a strong tie with resiliency. It also has, because oftentimes you're storing zero carbon energy, it certainly has a mitigation aspect to it. But I think that energy storage is something that you're seeing a lot of people becoming interested in, and what they're really doing is packaging a resiliency sort of business. So I would look for it there.
And I would say that there are companies, well, I'll make two comments. One is about real estate, and I think that if you were to stand back just in sort of a non-quantitative way and look at the way that valuations are done, you will see valuations which indirectly reflect physical impacts. There's no question, it's there. If you can go ask CoreLogic, they've done a little bit of work in this area. It's not manifest in the way that you would a share price valuation. It's not the same thing. It's a little more qualitative because there are multiple other values that are being considered in the process. With respect to companies, though, I think that the supply chain assessment, and I know that people at Zurich do a tremendous amount of work in this area, is really quite important. And in fact, I'm not sure, again, it would go to a traditional share price evaluation, but it's certainly a very important enterprise risk management issue, that companies realize that if significant or extreme events impact their supply chain, even if they have business interruption and coverage, that doesn't guarantee that their customers will be there when the interruption is concluded. And it doesn't guarantee that they will find alternative supplies. So there is a tremendous focus on supply chain resilience and security, but for beyond climate-related issues, for a multitude of issues.
If I could say something actually in response to both. One area that is analogous and that is much further along in this area is with hazardous waste contamination, where we now have a fairly well-developed disclosure and liability scheme. And we do see that the valuation of businesses and real estate is often affected by the presence of contamination. There are insurance products that are available that put a price on this. A lot of cleanups are done in anticipation of a sale to make sure that the valuation is not harmed. But it depends largely on an established system of studying and disclosing these kinds of risks that we do not yet have in the climate resilience area. So on the question of what policies are necessary, I think disclosure is one of them. In the absence of disclosure, we see real estate valuation that does not at all reflect the risks. I think there are areas of South Florida where the real estate would have a much lower value if there were full disclosure of the climate risks.
Okay, let's take the next couple of questions, starting here.
Hi, this is for Ms. Roberts. So you mentioned the typically short time horizons that are sort of typical of the way the financial industry manages risk traditionally, sort of quarterly time horizons, 3 months. And so to my knowledge, ever since the last financial crisis, that came under fire actually quite a lot. And there was a regulatory response to that, which was also quite extensive. But, did that work? And what other approaches to managing the short-term thinking in finance are there, in your opinion?
Do I think things have changed significantly? Not necessarily. I mean, my portion of the finance sector is about longer term horizons. And we actually get dinged quite a bit because we don't focus on quarterly returns. And so we often miss analyst targets because we're focused on longer term value. And so, repeatedly we'll get, dinged for that. And your quarterly returns weren't what they were supposed to be. And so, I don't think it's really changed much in the realm. I mean, I think, it has to go back to the fundamentals of business partially to really change, which is customer and supplier relationships and bringing the core value of a business back to its fundamentals, not quarterly results. And I think that has happened a little bit where people are, not, I think the financial sector really does try and look at the basics of the business. And that's where I think, over time, as people understand more and more of these issues, they're going to understand the risks associated with owning real estate in Florida. And, where the floodplain maps have really changed. Like, I would guess, I don't know for sure, but I would guess most of our real estate professionals who are on the financial side don't know how much the floodplain maps have changed. And, that's something I've kind of had on my to-do list is, get a bunch of those and make sure that our teams know how much these are changing. So, the fact that Carlyle now has hired somebody like me internally will change the conversation internally. But it's, it's new. So we've got work cut out for us.
Let's move to this side of the room.
My name's Daniel Wallach. I'm with an nonprofit organization called Greensburg Greentown, and we work in disaster recovery really around the country. My question is really pretty targeted to you, Lindene, in the insurance industry, and I'm not even sure how well you can respond to this given your day-to-day, but I'll try. One of the most frustrating things for me is going into disaster areas that are rebuilding and seeing people rebuild the same way. And that there's no incentives coming from the insurance industry or that aren't well articulated if they're there, or penalties for people who are building the same junk that was there that was destroyed. And in cases like Moore, Oklahoma, where there are areas that have now been hit 3 times in 15 years, where people have lost homes 3 times in 15 years, and they keep building them back the same way.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, but I'll give you some framing, and I think Michael actually might be able to provide a little context also, particularly from the legal side. The challenge that you face in the context of expecting that the insurance industry can fix a socioeconomic structure is pretty big. You should know that the insurance industry has, for more than a decade now, lobbied for improved building codes. and has done that nationwide. There's a collaborative called IBHS, the Institute for Building and Home Safety. It runs something called disastersafety.org. There's also the Stronger, Safer Coalition, which looks not also at flooding issues in addition to hurricanes and earthquakes and a variety of other issues that are looked at in the IBHS context. Building codes are controlled on a local level. And insurance is a unique animal in terms of its structure. It is a capital market function, but it is regulated. And it is regulated differentially for personal lines and commercial lines. And in most states, there is either an elected or an appointed insurance commissioner who will participate in discussions about how insurance policies for personal line structures are designed, structured, what coverage they include, and how those are priced. And those are movable pieces to assure economic viability and affordability and a variety of other social goals. So I think it's very important to look at the context in which insurance serves as a mechanism for improving economic sustainability and how other portions of the economy are structured and what needs to get done. As I had said in my earlier comments, we have as an institution, not only my company but others, offered insurance policies where people could buy a betterment coverage. They could buy a coverage where they could, for a small amount of additional premium, or in some cases a big amount, build beyond code. But the demand isn't there. It sits on the book. Gary's, gets dust. We have a few industries that were quite interested in that, particularly hospitality, certain other industries, which I can't really discuss, but who were quite interested in those and have taken it. But it's not a volume approach, and it's certainly nothing that's moving on Main Street. But it is an interesting opportunity in collaboration to try to figure out how it is we could get from current state to more resilient state, and what are those pieces in our existing economy, especially in a governance context, that might need a little shift or a move to better utilize these financial tools that, for example, as I have said repeatedly in insurance, if you had insurance that would improve or better in its structure on rebuild, avoid Einstein's definition of insanity, then you would have to create a regulatory environment which enabled that deployment as a priority.
I see we do have two more questions. We are running out of time, so let's take these two quick questions, and then any last very quick comments from our panelists.
This is from our lunchtime conversation, no man's an island, no corporation's an island. Have you seen any existing models of this public-private partnership that everyone talks about, and how could we better foster public-private cooperation to get at resilience? Because the corporation is only as resilient as the community.
And next question.
Good afternoon, Mike Hornsby from New Jersey Institute of Technology. A comment and a question. David, in your remarks, you mentioned that you asked if any businesses are out there that are not affected by climate such that they don't need to be regulated by the government. The answer to that might lie in William Nordhaus's recent book, The Climate Casino. In the book, he looks at the economy sector by sector and analyzes to what degree is each sector impacted. And the min was the service sector, and the max was the energy sector. My question goes to Michael. Michael, you mentioned the 2010 SEC guidance, which requires public companies to disclose the risks attributable to climate change. And you went on to say there's very spotty compliance with that guidance. I agree with that. And you went on to say the citizens can have an effect to influence how companies are disclosing that risk. And I want to ask you to elaborate on that, because I think that could help change the tide of this climate debate.
There are some organizations, Ceres is one of the leaders that take a systematic look at these disclosures. I think C2S does some of that as well, and some others that look at this disclosure. There is not as much of a private right of action for this kind of securities non-disclosure, because typically an investor needs to show that they themselves were damaged economically by the non-disclosure. But there are a lot of, it's like top 10, 10 best, 10 worst disclosure lists that are out there, ways to put public pressure on companies for failure to disclose.
And then, does anyone want to take the examples of public-private partnership?
Sure.
Question?
We have an investment that we made a few years ago where we own and have put a lot of improvements into the the toll plazas along the Merritt Parkway and 95 in Connecticut. And quite a few of those improvements relate to, we have electric charging stations, which is mitigation, not adaptation, but we also have solar panels that we've put up on some. And when I asked the deal team, have we put in the smart inverters so they can disconnect from the grid and run in isolation if the sun comes out after a storm, he didn't know. But I'm supposed to go tour them, sometime in the next month. So that might be an example, and I think that would be the kind of thing where, had we made that investment I now review all the deals that come up, so I would have immediately been able to say to the team, oh, these are the places that people are going to need to come to charge up their cell phones or provide some backup power to folks and be a community resource center, and how can we help that, and how can we work in partnership with the state, where if there's some things that don't make business sense but would be really valuable and would be cheaper for the state to do it on the toll plazas than having to set up a whole new community center, we can work together to build resilience in that context. So that would be one example.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and have the last word. And I think that the question is not so much, are there companies that are not impacted by climate? But the question is, with limited government resources, are there sectors that the government should focus on the most? And are there other sectors that are more or less capable of assessing the risks, or perhaps they need assistance in assessing the risks, but more or less capable of, once those risks are assessed, of addressing them? Let's see, we are out of time. A couple of announcements. First of all, there is on the back of your program, there is a survey. Please fill out the survey and return it in the back of the room. Second, it is now time for a break. Please come back here in 15 minutes for the next panel. And otherwise, please give a big round to our panelists.